Chapter 10. Flick's home was a bedsitter in a big old house in Bayswater. Her room was in the attic. If a bomb came through the roof, it would land on her bed. She spent little time there, not for fear of bombs, but because real life went on elsewhere. In France, at SOE headquarters, or at one of SOE's training centers around the country. There was little of her in the room. A photo of Michael playing a guitar, a shelf of Flaubert and Molière in French, a watercolor of nice she had painted at the age of 15. The small chest has 3 drawers of clothing and one of guns and ammunition. Feeling weary and depressed, she undressed and lay down on the bed, looking through a copy of Parade magazine. Berlin had been bombed by a force of 1,500 planes last Wednesday. She read. It was hard to imagine. She tried to picture what it must have been like for the ordinary Germans living there, and all she could think of was a medieval painting of hell, with naked people being burned alive in a hail of fire. She turned the page and read a silly story about second-rate cigarettes being passed off as woodbines. Her mind kept returning to yesterday's failure. She rewound the battle in her mind, imagining a dozen decisions she might have made differently, leading to victory instead of defeat. As well as losing the battle, she feared she might be losing her husband. And she wondered if there was a link, inadequate as a leader, inadequate as a wife. Perhaps there was some flaw deep in her character. Now that her alternative plan had been rejected, there was no prospect of redeeming herself. All those brave people had died for nothing. Eventually, she drifted into an uneasy sleep. She was awakened by someone banging on the door and calling, "Flick, telephone." The voice belonged to one of the girls in the flat below. The clock on Flick's bookshelf said 6. "Who is it?" she called. "He just said their office." "I'm coming." She pulled on a dressing gown, unsure whether it was 6 in the morning or evening. She glanced out of her little window. The sun was setting over the elegant terraces of Ladbroke Grove. She ran downstairs to the phone in the hall. Percy Thrott's voice said, "Sorry to rake you." "That's all right." She was always glad to hear Percy's voice on the other end of the phone. She had become very fond of him, even though he constantly sent her into danger. Running agents was a heartbreaking job, and some senior officers anesthetized themselves by adopting a hard-hearted attitude toward the death or capture of their people. But Percy never did that. He felt every loss as a bereavement. Consequently, Flick knew he would never take an unnecessary risk with her. She trusted him. "Can you come to Orchid Court?" She wondered if the authorities had reconsidered her new plan for taking out the telephone exchange, and her heart leaped with hope. Has Marty changed his mind? I'm afraid not. But I need you to brief someone. She bit her lip, suppressing her disappointment. I'll be there in a few minutes. She dressed quickly and took the underground to Baker Street. Percy was waiting for her in the flat in Portman Square. I found a radio operator. No experience, but he's done the training. I'm sending him to Reims tomorrow. Flick glanced reflexively at the window to check the weather, as agents always did when a flight was mentioned. Percy's curtains were drawn for security, but anyway, she knew the weather was fine. Reims? Why? We've heard nothing from Michael today. I need to know how much of the Bollinger circuit is left. Flick nodded. Pierre, the radio operator, had been in the attack squad. Presumably, he was captured or dead. Michael might have been able to locate Pierre's radio transceiver, but he had not been trained to operate it, and he certainly did not know the codes. But what's the point? We've sent them tons of explosives and ammunition in the last few months. I want them to light some fires. The telephone exchange is the most important target, but it's not the only one. Even if there's no one left but Michael and a couple of others, they can blow up railway lines, cut telephone wires, and shoot sentries. It all helps, but I can't direct them if I have no communication. Flick shrugged. To her, the chateau was the only target that mattered. Everything else was chicken feed. But what the hell? I'll brief him, of course. Percy gave her a hard look. He hesitated, then said, How was Michael, apart from his bullet wound? Fine, Flick. Flick was silent for a moment. Percy stared at her. She could not deceive him. He knew her too well. At last she sighed and said, There's a girl. I was afraid of that. I don't know whether there's anything left of my marriage, she said bitterly. I'm sorry. It would help if I could tell myself that I had made a sacrifice for a purpose, struck a magnificent blow for our side, made that invasion more likely to succeed. You've done more than most over the last 2 years, but there's no second prize in a war, is there? No. She stood up. She was grateful for Percy's fond sympathy, but it was making her maudlin. I'd better brief the new radio man. Code name Helicopter. He's waiting in the study. Not the sharpest knife in the box, I'm afraid, but a brave lad. This seemed sloppy to Flick. If he's not too bright, why send him? He might endanger others. As you said earlier, this is our big chance. If the invasion fails, we've lost Europe. We've got to throw everything we have at the enemy now, because we won't get another chance. Flick nodded grimly. He had turned her own argument against her, but he was right. The only difference was that the lives being endangered in this case included Michael's. Okay, she said. I'd better go on with it. He's eager to see you. She frowned. Eager? Why? Percy gave a wry smile. Go and find out for yourself. Flick left the drawing room of the apartment where Percy had his desk and went along the corridor. His secretary was typing in the kitchen, and she directed Flick to another room. Flick paused outside the door. This is how it is, she told herself. You pick yourself up and carry on working, hoping you will eventually forget. She entered the study, a small room with a square table and a few mismatched chairs. Helicopter was a fair-skinned boy of about 22, wearing a tweed suit in a checkered pattern of mustard, orange, and green. You could tell he was English from a distance of a mile. Fortunately, before he got on the plane, he would be kitted out in clothing that would look inconspicuous in a French town. So he employed French tailors and dressmakers who sewed continental-style clothes for agents, then spent hours making the clothes look worn and shabby so that they would not attract attention by their newness. There was nothing they could do about Helicopter's pink complexion and red blonde hair, except hope that the Gestapo would think he must have some German blood. Flick introduced herself and he said, Yes, we've met before, actually. I'm sorry, I don't remember. You were at Oxford with my brother, Charles. Charles Standish, of course. Flick remembered another fair boy in tweeds, taller and slimmer than Helicopter, but probably no cleverer. He had not taken a degree. Charlie spoke fluent French, she recalled, something they had in common. You came to our house in Gloucestershire once, actually. Flick recalled a weekend in a country house in the 30s, and a family with an amiable English father and a chic French mother. Charlie had a kid brother, Brian, an awkward adolescent in knee shorts, very excited about his new camera. She had talked to him a bit, and he had developed a little crush on her. So how is Charlie? I haven't seen him since we graduated. He's dead, actually. Brian looked suddenly grief-stricken. Died in 41. Killed in the bloody desert, actually. Flick was afraid he would cry. She took his hand in both of hers and said, Brian, I'm so terribly sorry. Jolly nice of you, he swallowed hard. With an effort he brightened. I've seen you since then, just once. You gave a lecture to my SOE training group. I didn't get a chance to speak to you afterwards. I hope my talk was useful. You spoke about traitors within the resistance and what to do about them. It's quite simple, you said. You put the barrel of your pistol to the back of the bastard's head and pull the trigger twice. Scared us all to death, actually. He was looking at her with something like hero worship in his eyes, and she began to see what Percy had been hinting at. It looked as if Brian still had a crush on her. She moved away from him, sat at the other side of the table, and said, Well, we'd better begin. You know you're going to make contact with a resistance circuit that has been largely wiped out. Yes, I aim to find out how much of it is left, and what it is still capable of doing, if anything. It's likely that some members were captured during the skirmish. yesterday and are under Gestapo's interrogation as we speak. So you'll have to be especially careful. Your contact in Reims is a woman, codename Burgess. Every day at 11 in the morning, she goes to the crypt of the cathedral to pray. She's generally the only person there, but in case there are others, she'll be wearing odd shoes, one black and one brown. Easy enough to remember. You say to her, "Pray for me." She replies, "I pray for peace." That's the code. He repeated the words. She'll take you to her house, then put you in touch with the head of the Bollinger Circuit, whose code name is Monet. She was talking about her husband, but Brian did not need to know that. Don't mention the address or real name of Burgess to other members of the circuit. When you meet them, please, for security reasons, it's better they don't know. Flick herself had recruited Burgess and set up the cutout. Even Miguel had not met the woman. I understand. Is there anything you want to ask me? I'm sure there are 100 things, but I can't think of any. She stood up and came around the table to shake his hand. Well, good luck. He kept hold of her hand. I never forgot that weekend you came to our house, he said. I expect I was a frightful bore, but you were very kind to me. She smiled and said lightly, You were a nice kid. I fell in love with you, actually. She wanted to jerk her hand out of his and walk away, but he might die tomorrow, and she could not bring herself to be so cruel. I'm flattered, she said, trying to maintain an amiably bantering tone. It was no good. He was in earnest. I was wondering, would you, just for luck, give me a kiss? She hesitated. Oh hell, she thought. She stood on tiptoe and kissed him lightly on the lips. She let the kiss linger for a second, then broke away. He looked transfixed by joy. She petted his cheeks softly with her hand. Stay alive, Brian, she said. Then she went out. She returned to Percy's room. He had a pile of books and a scatter of photographs on his desk. All done, he said. She nodded. But he's not perfect secret agent materia, Percy. Percy shrugged. He is brave. He speaks French like a Parisian, and he can shoot straight. 2 years ago, you would have sent him back to the army. True. Now I'm going to send him off to Sandy. At a large country house in the village of Sandy, near the Thamesford airstrip, Brian would be dressed in French-style clothes and given the forged papers he needed to pass through Gestapo checkpoints and buy food. Percy got up and went to the door. While I'm seeing him off, have a look at that rogue's gallery, will you? He pointed to the photos on the desk. Those are all the pictures MI6 has of the German officers. If the man you saw in the square at Santa Cecile should happen to be among them, I'd be interested to know his name. He went out. Flick picked up one of the books. It was a graduation yearbook from a military academy, showing postage stamp size photos of a couple of hundred fresh-faced young men. There were a dozen or more similar books, and several hundred loose photos. She did not want to spend all night looking at mugshots, but perhaps she could narrow it down. The man in the square had seemed about 40. He would have graduated at the age of 22, roughly. So the year must have been about 1926. None of the books was that old. She turned her attention to the loose photographs as she flicked through. She recalled all she could of the man. He was quite tall and well dressed, but that would not show in the photo. He had thick dark hair, she thought, and although he was clean shaven, he looked as if he could grow a heavy beard. She remembered dark eyes, clearly marked eyebrows, a straight nose, a square chin, quite the matinee idol, in fact. The loose photos had been taken in all sorts of different situations. Some were new pictures showing officers shaking hands with Hitler, inspecting troops, or looking at tanks and airplanes. A few seemed to have been snapped by spies. These were the most candid shots, taken in crowds, from cars or through windows, showing the officers shopping, talking to children, hailing a taxi, lighting a pipe. She scanned at the photos as fast as she could, tossing them to one side. She hesitated over each dark-haired man. None was as handsome as the one she recalled from the square. She passed over a photo of a man in police uniform, then went back to it. The uniform had first put her off, but on careful study, she thought this was him. She turned the photograph over, pasted it to the back was a typewritten sheet. She read, Frank Dieter Wolfgang, sometimes Frankie, born Cologne 3, June 1904, Educt Humboldt University of Berlin, and Cologne Police Academy, Ma, 1930. Waltrand Lurie, one son, one daughter. Superintendent Criminal Investigation Department, Cologne Police, to 1940. Major Intelligence Section, Africa Corps 2. A star of Rommel's intelligence staff, this officer is said to be a skilled interrogator and a ruthless torturer. Flick shuddered to think she had been so near to such a dangerous man. An experienced police detective who had turned his skills to military intelligence was a frightening enemy. The fact that he had a family in Cologne did not prevent his having a mistress in France, it seemed. Percy returned, and she handed him the picture. This is the man. Dear Frank, said Percy. We know of him. How interesting. From what you overheard of his conversation in the square, Rommel seems to have given him some kind of counter-resistance job. He made a note on his pad. I'd better let MI6 know, as they loaned us their photos. There was a tap at the door, and Percy's secretary looked in. There's someone to see you, Colonel Threat. The girl looked coquettish. The fatherly Percy never inspired that sort of behavior in secretaries. So Flick guessed the visitor must be an attractive man. An American, the girl added. That might explain it. Flick thought. Americans were the height of glamour, to secretaries at least. How did he find this place? Percy said. Orchard Court was supposed to be a secret address. He went to number 64 Baker Street, and they sent him here. They shouldn't do that. He must be very persuasive. Who is he? Major Chancellor. Percy looked at Flick. She did not know anyone called Chancellor. Then she remembered the arrogant Major who had been so rude to her this morning at Monty's headquarters. Oh, God, him? She said in disgust. What does he want? Send him in, said Percy. Paul the Chancellor came in. He walked with a limp that Flick had not noticed this morning. It probably got worse as the day wore on. He had a pleasant American face with a big nose and a jutting chin. Any chance he might have had of being handsome was spoiled by his left ear, or what remained of it, which was the lower 1/3 mostly lobe. Flick assumed he had been wounded in action. Chancellor saluted and said, Good evening, Colonel. Good evening, Major. Percy said, We don't do a lot of saluting at SOE, Chancellor. Please sit down. What brings you here? Chancellor took a chair and removed his uniform cap. I'm glad I caught you both, he said. I spent most of the day thinking about this morning's conversation. He gave a self-effacing grin. Part of the time, I had to confess, I was composing wittily, crushing remarks I could have made it if only I had thought of them in time. Flick could not help smiling. She had done the same. Chancellor went on. You hinted Colonel Threat that MI6 might not have told the whole truth about the attack on the telephone exchange, and that played on my mind. The fact that Major Clariette here was so rude to me did not necessarily mean she was lying about the facts. Flick had been halfway to forgiving him, but now she bridled. Rude, me? Percy said, Shut up, Flick. She closed her mouth. So I sent for your report, Colonel. Of course, the request came from Monty's office, not me personally. So it was brought to our headquarters by a fanny motorcyclist in double-quick time. He was a no-nonsense type who knew how to pull the levers of the military machine. Flick thought he might be an arrogant pig, but he would make a useful ally. When I read it, I realized the main reason for defeat was wrong intelligence. Supplied by MI6, Flick said indignantly. Yes, I noticed that, Chancellor said, with a mild sarcasm. Obviously, MI6 was covering up its own incompetence. I'm not a career soldier myself, but my father is, so I'm familiar with the tricks of military bureaucrats. Oh, said Percy thoughtfully. Are you the son of General Chancellor? Yes. Go on. MI6 would never have gotten away with it if your boss had been at the meeting this morning to tell SOE's side of the story. It seemed too much of a coincidence that he had been called away at the last minute. Percy looked dubious. He was summoned by the Prime Minister. I don't see how MI6 could have arranged that. The meeting was not intended by Churchill. A Downing Street aide took the chair, and it had been arranged at the instigation of MI6. Well, I'm damned, Flick said angrily. They are such snakes. Percy said, I wish they were as clever about gathering intelligence as they are about deceiving their colleagues. Chancellor said, I also looked in detail at your plan, Major Cleriot, for taking the chateau by stealth, with the team disguised as cleaners. It's risky, of course, but it could work. Did that mean it would be reconsidered? Flick hardly dared to ask. Percy gave Chancellor a level look. So what are you going to do about all this? By chance, I had dinner with my father tonight. I told him the whole story and asked him what a general's aide should do in these circumstances. We were at the Savory. What did he say? Flick asked impatiently. She did not care which restaurant they had gone to. That I should go to Monty and tell him we had made a mistake. He grimaced. Not easy with any general. They never like to revisit decisions, but sometimes it has to be done. And will you? Flick said hopefully. I already have. Percy said in surprise, You don't waste time, do you? Flick held her breath. It hardly seemed possible, after a day of despair, that she might be given the second chance she longed for. Chancellor said, Monty was remarkably good about it, in the end. Flick could not contain her agitation. For God's sake, what did he say about my plan? He's authorized it. Thank God, she jumped up, unable to sit still. Another chance, Percy said. Splendid. Chancellor held up a warning hand. 2 more things. The first one you may not like. He's put me in charge of the operation. You? Flick said. Why? Said Percy. You don't cross-examine the general when he gives an order. I'm sorry you seemed dismayed. Monty has faith in me, even if you don't. Percy shrugged. Flick said, What's the other stipulation? There's a time constraint. I can't tell you when the invasion will be, and in fact, the date has not been finally decided. But I can tell you that we have to accomplish our mission very quickly. If you haven't achieved the objective by midnight next Monday, it will probably be too late. Next Monday, said Flick. Yes, said Paul Chancellor. We have exactly 1 week. The 3rd day, Tuesday, May 30th, 1944. Chapter 11. Flick left London at dawn, driving a Vincent Comet motorcycle with a powerful 500cc engine. The roads were deserted, gas was severely rationed, and drivers could be jailed for making unnecessary journeys. She drove very fast. It was dangerous, but exciting. The thrill was worth the risk. She felt the same about the mission. Scared but eager. She had stayed up late last night with Percy and Paul, drinking tea and planning. There must be 6 women in the team, they had decided, as it was the unvarying number of cleaners on a shift. One had to be an explosive expert, another a telephone engineer, to decide exactly where the charges should be placed, to ensure that exchange was crippled. She wanted 1 good marksman and 2 tough soldiers. With herself, that would make 6. She had 1 day to find them. The team would need a minimum of 2 days training. They had to learn to parachute if nothing else. That would take up Wednesday and Thursday. They would be dropped near Reims on Friday night and entered the chateau on Saturday evening or Sunday. That left 1 spare day as a margin for error. She crossed the river at London Bridge. Her motorbike roared through the bomb-ravaged wharves and tenements of Bermondsey and Rotherhithe. There she took the Old Kent Road, traditional route of pilgrims, toward Canterbury. As she left the suburbs behind, she opened the throttle and gave the bike its head. For a while, she let the wind blow the worries out of her hair. It was not yet 6 o'clock when she reached Summer's home, the country house of the Barons of Coldfield. The Baron himself, William, was in Italy, fighting his way toward Rome with the 8th Army. Flick knew his sister, the Honorable Diane Coldfield, was the only member of the family living here now. The vast house, with its dozens of bedrooms for house guests and their servants, was being used as a convalescent home for wounded soldiers. Flick slowed the bike to walking speed and drove up the avenue of 100-year-old lime trees, gazing at the great pile of pink granite ahead, with its bays, balconies, gables, and roofs, acres of windows, and scores of chimneys. She parked on the gravel forecourt next to an ambulance and a scatter of jeeps. In the hall, nurses bustled about with cups of tea. The soldiers might be here to convalesce, but they still had to be wakened at daybreak. Flick asked for Mrs. Wiley, the housekeeper, and was directed to the basement. She found her staring worriedly at the furnace, in the company of 2 men in overalls. "Hello, Ma," said Flick. Her mother hugged her hard. She was even shorter than her daughter, and just as thin. But like Flick, she was stronger than she looked. The hug squeezed the breath out of Flick. Gasping and laughing, she extricated herself. "Ma, you'll crush me." "I never know if you're alive until I see you," her mother said in her voice. There was still a trace of the Irish accent she had left Cork with her parents 45 years ago. "What's the matter with the furnace? It was never designed to produce so much hot water. These nurses are mad for cleanliness. They force the poor soldiers to bathe every day. Come to my kitchen, and I'll make you some breakfast. Flick was in a hurry, but she told herself she had time for her mother. Anyway, she had to eat. She followed Ma up the stairs and into the servants' quarters. Flick had grown up in this house. She had played in the servants' hall, run wild in the woods, attended the village school a mile away, and returned to here from boarding school and university for the vacations. She had been extraordinarily privileged. Most women in her mother's positions were forced to give up their jobs when they had a child. Ma had been allowed to stay partly because the old Baron had been somewhat unconventional, but mainly because she was such a good housekeeper that he had dreaded losing her. Flick's father had been butler, but he had died when she was 6 years old. Every February, Flick and her ma had accompanied the family to their villa in Nice, which was where Flick had learned French. The old Baron, father of William and Diana, had been fond of Flick and had encouraged her to study, even paying her school fees. He had been very proud when she had won a scholarship to Oxford University. When he died, soon after the start of the war, Flick had been as heartbroken as if he had been her real father. The family now occupied only a small corner of the house. The old butler's pantry had become the kitchen. Flick's mother put the kettle on. "Just a piece of toast will be fine, Ma," said Flick. Her mother ignored her and started frying bacon. "Well, I can see you're all right," she said. "How's that handsome husband?" "Michael's alive," Flick said. She sat at the kitchen table. The smell of bacon made her mouth water. "Alive, is he? But not well, evidently. Wounded." "He got a bullet in his bum. It won't kill him." "You've seen him, then?" Flick laughed. "Ma, stop it. I'm not supposed to say." "Of course not. Is he keeping his hands off other women? If that's not a military secret." Flick never ceased to be startled by the accuracy of her mother's intuition. It was quite eerie. "I hope he is." "Anyone in particular that you hope he's keeping his hands off?" Flick did not answer the question directly. "Have you noticed, Ma, that men sometimes don't seem to realize when a girl is really stupid?" Ma made a disgusted noise. "So that's the way of it. She's pretty, I suppose." "Young, 19. "Have you had it out with him?" "Yes. He promised to stop." "He might keep his promise if you're not away too long. I'm hopeful." Ma looked crestfallen. "So you're going back?" "I can't say." "Have you not done enough?" "We haven't won the war yet, so no. I suppose I haven't." Ma put a plate of bacon and eggs in front of Flick. It probably represented a week's rations, but Flick suppressed the protest that came to her lips. Better to accept the gift gracefully. Besides, she was certainly ravenous. "Thanks, Ma," she said. "You spoil me." Her mother smiled, satisfied, and Flick tucked in hungrily. As she ate, she reflected wryly that Ma had effortlessly got out of her everything she wanted to know, despite Flick's attempts to avoid answering questions. "You should work for military intelligence," she said through a mouthful of fried egg. "They could use you as an interrogator. You've made me tell you everything. I'm your mother. I've a right to know." It didn't much matter. Ma would not repeat any of it. She sipped a cup of tea as she watched Flick eat. "You've got to win the war all on your own, of course," she said with fond sarcasm. "You were that way from a child, independent to a fault." "I don't know why. I was always looked after. When you were busy there were if when you were busy there were half a dozen housemaids starting on me. I think I encouraged you to be self-sufficient because you didn't have a father. Whenever you wanted me to do something for you, like fix a bicycle chain or sew on a button, I used to say, 'Try it yourself, and if you can't manage, I'll help you.' 9 times out of 10, I heard no more about it." Flick finished the bacon and wiped her plate with a slice of bread. "A lot of the time, Mark used to help me." Mark was Flick's brother, a year older. Her mother's face froze. "Is that right?" she said. Flick suppressed a sigh. Ma had quarreled with Mark 2 years ago. He worked in the theater as a stage manager and lived with an actor called Steve. Ma had long known that Mark was not the marrying kind, as she put it, but in a burst of excessive honesty, Mark had been foolish enough to tell Ma that he loved Steve, and they were like husband and wife. She had been mortally offended and had not spoken to her son since. Flick said, "Mark loves you, Ma." "Does he now? I wish you'd see him." "No doubt." Ma picked up Flick's empty plate and washed it in the sink. Flick shook her head in exasperation. "You're a bit stubborn, Ma." "I dare say that's where you get it from, then." Flick had to smile. She had often been accused of stubbornness. "Mullish" was Percy's word. She made an effort to be conciliatory. "Well, I suppose you can't help the way you feel. Anyway, I'm not going to argue with you, especially after such a wonderful breakfast." All the same, it was her ambition to get the two of them to make up. But not today. She stood up. Ma smiled. "It's lovely to see you. I worry about you. I've got another reasons for coming. I need to talk to Diana. Whatever for, can't say. I hope you're not thinking of taking her to France with you." "Ma, hush. Who said anything about going to France?" "I suppose it's because she's so handy with a gun." "I can't say." "She'll get you killed. She doesn't know what discipline is. Why should she? She wasn't brought up that way. Not her fault, of course, but you'd be a fool to rely on her." "Yes, I know," Flick said impatiently. She had made her decision, and she was not going to review it with Ma. She's had several war jobs and been sacked from every one. I know, but Diana was a crack shot, and Flick did not have time to be fussy. She had to take what she could get. Her main worry was that Diana might refuse. No one could be forced to do undercover work. It was strictly for volunteers. Where is Diana now? Do you know? I believe she's in the woods, Ma said. She went out early after rabbits. Of course, Diana loved all the blood sports. Fox hunting, deer stalking, hare coursing, grouse shooting, even fishing. If there was nothing else to do, she would shoot rabbits. Just follow the sound of gunfire. Flick kissed her mother's cheek. Thanks for breakfast. She went to the door. And don't get on the wrong side of a gun, Ma called after her. Flick left by the staff door, crossed the kitchen garden, and entered the woods at the rear of the house. The trees were bright with new leaves, and the nettles grew waist high. Flick tramped through the undergrowth in her heavy motorcycle boots and leather trousers. The best way to attract Diana, she thought, would be by issuing a challenge. When she had gone a quarter of the mile into the woods, she heard the report of a shotgun. She stopped, listened, and shouted, "Diana!" There was no reply. She walked toward the sound, calling out every minute or so. Eventually she heard, "Over here, you noisy idiot, whoever you are. Coming, just put down the gun." She came upon Diana in a clearing, sitting on the ground with her back against an oak tree, smoking a cigarette. A shotgun lay across her knees, broken open for reloading, and there were half a dozen dead rabbits beside her. "Oh, it's you," she said. "You scared all the game away." "They'll come back tomorrow." Flick studied her childhood companion. Diana was pretty in a boyish way, with dark hair cut short and freckles across her nose. She wore a shooting jacket and corduroy trousers. "How are you, Diana?" "Bored, frustrated, depressed, otherwise fine." Flick sat on the grass beside her. This might be easier than she had thought. "What's the matter?" "I'm rotting away in the English countryside while my brother's conquering Italy." "How is William?" "He's all right. He's part of the war effort, but no one will give me a proper job." "I might be able to help you there." "You're in the fannies." Diana drew on her cigarette and blew out smoke. "Darling, I can't be a chauffeuse." Flick nodded. Diana was too grand to do the menial war work that most women were offered. "Well, I'm here to propose something more interesting." "What?" "You may not like it. It's very difficult and dangerous." Diana looked skeptical. "What does it involve? Driving in the blackout?" "I can't tell you much about it, because it's secret." "Flick, darling, don't tell me you're involved in cloak and dagger stuff." "I didn't get promoted to major by driving generals to meetings." Diana looked hard at her. "Do you mean this?" "Absolutely." "Good Lord." Against her will, Diana was impressed. Flick had to get her positive agreements to volunteer. So are you willing to do something very dangerous? I mean it. You really are quite likely to get killed. Diana looked excited, rather than discouraged. Of course I'm willing. William's risking his life, why shouldn't I? You mean it? I'm very serious. Flick concealed her relief. She had recruited her first team member. Diana was so keen that Flick decided to press her advantage. There's a condition, and you may find it worse than the danger. What? You're 2 years older than I, and all our lives you've been my social superior. You're the Baron's daughter, and I'm the housekeeper's brat. Nothing wrong with that, and I'm not complaining. Ma would say that's how it should be. Yes, dear, so what's your point? I'm in charge of the operation. You'll have to defer to me. Diana shrugged. That's fine. It will be a problem, Flick insisted. You'll find it strange, but I'll be hard on you until you get used to it. This is a warning. Yes, sir. We don't bother too much about the formalities in my department, so you won't need to call me sir or ma'am. But we do enforce military discipline, especially once an operation has begun. If you forget that, my anger will be the least of your worries. Disobeying orders can get you killed in my line of work. Darling, how dramatic. But of course I understand. Flick was not at all sure Diana did understand, but she had done her best. She took a scratch pad from her blouse and wrote down an address in Hampshire. Pack a case for 3 days. This is where you need to go. You get the train from Waterloo to Brockenhurst. Diana looked at the address. Why, this is Lord Montague's estate. Most of it is occupied by my department now. What is your department? The Inner Services Research Bureau, Flick said, using the usual cover name. I trust it's more exciting than it sounds. You can bet on that. When do I start? You need to get there today. Flick got to her feet. Your training starts at dawn tomorrow. I'll come back to the house with you and start packing. Diana stood up. Tell me something, if I can. Diana fiddled with her shotgun, seeming embarrassed. When she looked at Flick, her face shone an expression of frankness for the first time. Why me? She said. You must know I've been turned down by everyone. Flick nodded. I'll be blunt. She looked at the blood-stained rabbit corpses on the ground, then lifted her gaze to Diana's pretty face. You're a killer, she said, and that's what I need.